Just more than a year ago, someone not far from Jackson, Mississippi, called in a complaint to the police. Two black men were staying with a white woman in her home. And a band of 6 officers, all of them white, went to investigate. They styled themselves the Goon Squad. They restrained the 2 black men. They beat them. They raped them. They shot one of them in the face. Then they cooked up a plot to blame the victims. Much of that isn't surprising, sad to say. But here is what is surprising. When one of them was sentenced just last Thursday, here is what he said to one of the men he had abused. "Mr. Jenkins, I failed you. I hit you and tried to force a sex toy in your mouth. I know that after that night, you will never be the same. I could have tried to stop it, but I didn't." And then all of the papers say the officer began to wail. That is the word that appeared consistently. He began to wail. I can believe that the officer was telling the truth. I can believe that when the frenzy of the torture lifted, and in the clear light of day, he could not believe what he was capable of. He wailed because he saw himself for who he was, and he was not able to bear the sight of himself. I imagine that the people who welcomed Jesus into Jerusalem, who treated him like a king, who cheered him on his way, would never have believed that just a handful of days later, they would be demanding that he die. But they did. It's amazing what we people can do when we become part of a mob, of a squad. It is startling how quickly people can turn, and how completely they can turn. We find ourselves saying and doing things that would have seemed impossible just minutes before, and then when we snap out of it, what we see in the mirror makes us wail. I have no idea what any of those police officers was like left to himself, with his friends, with his family, with himself in solitude. I have no idea what each of them was. But I can imagine that each of them in himself was not a goon. But together they became something unimaginable. Each of us, left to our own devices, can most of the time talk ourselves off the ledge. But when we become a mob, when we become a squad, we are capable of what we cannot imagine of ourselves. And then the frenzy lifts, and we find ourselves alone and in shock. I could have tried to stop it, but I didn't. So the officer said, I could have tried to stop it, but I didn't. The people who demanded that Jesus be tortured and put to death, after they had gone home to their family and their friends and their own privacy. I wonder how many found themselves like people waking out of a drunken binge and not believing what they had done, not believing that they were nothing but an ancient goon squad. Someone last week in this very assembly said to me that the cross is like a mirror. And that's right. The cross is like a mirror that shows us part of what we are. And it is shocking. If you had been in Jerusalem that week, would you have been able to stop yourself from being swept up in the madness of the squad? I'd like to pretend that I could have. But the key word is pretend. I'm not that special. Then, an hour later or a day later, I can see myself waking out of the frenzy, not believing what I had done. And in my solitude, I would wail. Because then it would have been too late. I had my chance, and I let it slip by. Luke tells us that after Jesus had been murdered, his disciples locked themselves into a room together. Luke tells us that they were huddling in fear. But I have to wonder if they weren't also huddling in shame. They were in that angry crowd that killed their Lord, in that mob, in that squad. I can imagine them huddled in shame, wailing, not because they caused Jesus' death, but because they did nothing to stop it. I could have tried to stop it, but I didn't. And then Jesus himself, his wondrous, risen self, came to them, right into their fear, right into their shame, right into their disbelief at their own evil. And he said, "Peace." And that is what Jesus says to us when we find ourselves face to face with what evil we do, and face to face with the good we fail to do. When the mob goes after black people or asylum seekers or trans people, and you know the list. I could have tried to stop it, but I didn't, we say. Peace. Peace, Jesus says to us. Today, the cross is a mirror, showing ourselves part of ourselves that we would prefer not to see. But the crucified and risen Lord, the victim of our human sinfulness, who wishes it were not so, looks upon us from the cross, not with judgment, but only with love. Here might I stay and sing no story so divine. Never was love, dear King, never was grief like thine. This is my friend, in whose sweet praise I all my days could gladly spend.